Chapter 12. The City. Gregory Enola is a difficult person to read. On the surface, he's kind and spiritual, not one to shy away from sharing his accomplishments in life. Selfless, willing to sacrifice his life for someone like me, someone who was at one point a stranger. My only issue with the man is that what he portrays is merely the surface, masking from the world several key traits that remove him from the one safe, categorized box he held in my mind. Gregory, for all his virtues, was sadistic in his treatment of animals. Despite his extensive studies, close-minded and ignorant of others' emotions and desires, a characterization often held by psychopaths, not a religious missionary sculpted from God's hands to be a perfect celestial being. He strayed from the mold in my head, something that was frustrating for someone who relies heavily on his own intuition and cognitive process. As the man I once knew strolled past me and up the path towards the chattering in the air, I grew sick, physically repulsed by the foolishness I possessed, allowing myself to depend on another, putting my faith into a bundle of lies. It confirmed what I always feared and always attempted to avoid. Not even a godlike man such as Gregory can be trusted. "You killed it," I said, still in shock at the sight of the beast crashing to the floor. The splattering of guts atop the stone scrapyard below repeated across my brain, echoing louder with each second that passed. "Very observant, Walter. Now answer this question for me. Why did I kill it?" said Gregory, through spurts of empty laughter. "It could have killed us," I replied. "Correct, my friend. That should end this discussion, no? A fitting reason to kill another, and while you may not share this same reasoning, I found our lives to be a tad more important than a pair of savages. Just because they learned a cute parlor trick and learned your name doesn't change that fact," he clamored. Gregory was growing brasher by the minute. I wasn't done with them, Greg. I still had questions. I needed to know how they knew me. Why they keep telling me to stop trusting you, why they keep trying to make me turn from you. Gregory then stopped in his tracks, his chest revealing a deep blow of disappointment as his neck cracked and fists clenched. "You believe then? You've lost trust in me. Walter Mai, after all I've done for you, you're losing faith?" he fumed. "I never said I didn't trust you," I corrected. "You never had to," murmured Gregory, stomping his feet into the dirt while he marched. "Dwelling on the words of complete and utter buffoons is all the confirmation I needed. You've come undone, my poor friend. Perhaps I pushed you too hard, or perhaps I haven't pushed you enough. I can't seem to find the answers for you, Walter, but I think I know someone who can," he continued, scaling up a slope that brought us closer to the clamoring of voices. "Do you expect me to just ignore what they say? I don't see them talking to you, Gregory." "And thank God they don't. They're playing mind games on you, Walter, dividing us to defeat us. They know we're weak, and they're exploiting our weaknesses. Your mind and my heart. And it's working to perfection. So how about you use that big brain of yours and wake up? We're dealing with invalids here. Stop validating them. Stop letting the words of a few idiots corrupt you," he barked. "What would you call Darwin, then?" I asked, not satisfied with his non-answer. "An outlier. A deviation from the mean. I could come up with more synonyms if you like, but the cruel truth is that he was not like the others. Don't waste your time empowering them. It's quite possible they overheard me saying your name. It's possible they were just instructed to say your name. It's possible that this is all just going on in your head. It's possible that paranoia has driven you off the brink. And it's also possible I'm telling you the exact truth. Believe what you want." Gregory offered me a heaping pile of possibilities, but not one probability. Nevertheless, I agreed with him on one point. If I wanted to find answers, all I had to do was shut up and keep walking. The both of us traveled for quite some time through the woods, drained and bleary-eyed as the incline rose and rose. I would have recommended we take a rest, but I knew Gregory well. At least I thought I did. Resting would have been a waste of time in his mind, especially because we were so close to our target. Voices were smacking louder and louder in the air as we marched upward. The content, however, was still incoherent, although that may have been due to the slough of mud still encumbered in the canals of my eardrums. In truth, it felt like another monotonous climb, that is until the words, "We are here," sparked in the sky. Gregory thundered forward, exuberant as he rushed towards our finish line. Gregory was, as usual, several feet in front of me, now standing proudly atop the hill we've been trekking up for 20 minutes. Before the question fell from my lips, I realized where Gregory was so certain. As I reached the precipice, I spotted an anomaly. Amongst the plethora of gargantuan trees emerged a fort, a majestic tower of timber that stretched acres wide, bedecked in a showering of decorations that cascaded down the columns with elegance. Across the great wall stood an architectural feat brimming with soft emerald moss and sown pine. Around the base lay no spikes or spears, but vibrant gold and plum flowers blossoming out of a finely kept garden. A sight to behold. In the epicenter of that crater stood a gate. It was both massive and ominous, as no human was visible. Despite this, the alluring voice sang in the air, as loud as ever. "Are you ready?" Gregory asked, gleaming from ear to ear with his mustard-stained teeth. "Ready for what?" "We're going to knock. So make sure you have a warm, welcoming face on, Walter. No more of that grumpy mug of yours." He then spat on his hand and wiped off some slop that was caked on my face. I stopped him before my urge to punch grew any more desirable. "You're insane," I said, befuddled at the mere thought of barging up to the entrance. "Sometimes it feels like you have a death wish. If you feel like rolling the dice with whatever cockeyed behemoth that ends up answering that door, then go ahead. Before you do, please use a minuscule amount of your brain power and try remembering all the batshit crazy friends we've made on this island. Now let's predict. If..." My voice became muffled as he covered my mouth with his filtered hand. "Let's skip all the hypotheticals and just find out," he said, calm as ever. "I concede. Walking up to the gate is a tad risky. It's a fair point." "Points for you, Walt. Instead, what if we took a glimpse inside the fort? A brief gander, just to see who lives there." I attempted to respond, but his plump, smutty fingers clogged my mouth. After finally noticing my struggle and slight suffocation, he removed them and smiled. "Good plan," I said, and spat square on the man's chest. "Next time you touch me, make sure you don't have crap stuck on your sausages," I exclaimed, pulling pieces of dirt out from my mouth. A deep bellow echoed in the air as he continued, "Oh, how silly of me! I apologize, Mr. Mai. Now, the important part. How does one go about spying and prying within a place like this?" he asked, stroking his beard as he pondered the question. I analyzed the area for any point of entry. Luckily, the barriers were still pregnable, far different from the barricades that sheltered against my army of brutes. Instead, these fences were climbable, but we'd have to get creative. "You don't see any more ladders lying around, do you?" I joked. Gregory responded, like with most of my jokes, very literally. "None in sight, although we could build one if I had the right tools. I have built many a ladder in my days, most made of steel, but wood wouldn't be too hard to fashion, especially if—" I stopped him before his rambling did any more damage to my brain. Instead of running along another track of ramblings, I tugged Gregory by his burly arm and pulled him along as we approached the castle, exhausted from talking and beguiled by action. The both of us crawled on our hands and knees, creeping along like caterpillars as we hid under the brush, safe and out of sight from the invisible men that patrolled the castle's walls. We slithered alongside the edge, nearing closer to the chattering and jeering. It seemed as if a tiff was boiling inside the sculpture's skin. Regardless, our intrigue got the better of us. We were destined to find an answer to our truckload of question marks. Our pack of ninjas pushed forward alongside the circular, windy road that lied parallel to the brims of the wall. It was a dirt path with canary hue that stretched abound like a track placed around a field. The air around twinged with smoke, a grey fog that funneled through the seams of pine and into our nostrils. It was a smell paired with a roasted meat that fumed into my veins, eliciting saliva to droop from my lips. Pavlov would have been proud as my body shook with excitement, the aroma consuming my depleted neurons. "Keep moving," I said through gritted teeth, as I could tell Gregory was growing tired of our stroll. Our journey found us in the back of the fort, now far away from any sounds or smells. The once stout wall was now a shoddy wreckage. Fortification of the fort's defenses must have not have been needed, as the area was abandoned and subdued. Eventually, Gregory mustered the courage to emerge from the soil and approach the structure. I followed behind while he attempted to climb the wall. He leaped and scratched at the wood like a feline, but was futile in his attempts, receiving a lashing of splinters and scrapes. I jogged a few meters onward until I discovered mounds of lumber and branches all clustered together, perfect kindling for a 1,000-foot fire. Alongside the wood was an enormous pile of hay, pressed softly against the wall. I climbed my way up the pile, falling a couple times before I could reach the top. An embarrassing fact. Let's just keep that between you and I. "Gregory, come over here," I whispered, as he was still thrashing away at the barrier. Once pride and stubbornness bled away, he ambled over, plucking at his arms which were dosed with fresh scars, and climbed up next to me. Both of us used our last bursts of arm strength to pull ourselves to the top of the barrier and peeked our heads over. It was no pit for beasts or animals. It was more like an ancient city, buildings constructed with stones and lumber, artfully built huts decorated and placed with steady care, trees bountiful with fruits, gardens lush with fresh vegetables, and acres of rich fertile land as far as the eye could see. We'd been transported from our deadly desert or wilderness into an oasis, a small patch of wonderland with no living beings in sight. "Where is everyone?" I asked, inching my head deeper to get a better look. "Let's find out," exclaimed Gregory, as he then heaved me over the wall. Flushed with surprise, I flipped forward and crashed into my back, falling like a fool while my chest collapsed within itself. Empty breaths pounded away as the wind vacuumed up my lungs. Gregory leaped onto the floor next to me and planted square on his feet, a perfect landing. He then lifted me up and held the bridge of my nose as tight as he could. "Deep breaths, Walt. It will all be over soon. You have to realign your diaphragm. Use deep breaths through your mouth and stand straight," he commented. Not long ago, my nose was cracked and broken. My nerve endings didn't forget that point, as Gregory's pinch reverted several days of healing. Eventually, my deep breaths let in but a few puffs of air, enough for me to tell Gregory to get the fuck off me. My scream, however faint, did not take Gregory by surprise. Instead, he nodded along with every insult I slung his way. "I deserve that, but just calm down. Catch your breath." "In what world is something like that acceptable?" I sobbed through fits of pain. In response, like the dick he often was, he smirked. Glad you asked. In a world where men like you are afraid to jump 10 feet over a wall. In a world where I don't like arguing for half an hour over something that's inescapable." Smug as ever, he offered his hand. "I can carry if you'd like. Wouldn't be the first time," he commented. I waved him off as I rose from the floor. I scuttled like a zombie, aching and oozing blood while my moans sung a song of pain. "Fear not, Walter. I believe I realigned the bones perfectly. You're much more handsome now, especially with that beard. It suits you well," exclaimed Gregory, slipping back into his silly, lacking self-awareness self. It was growing quite stale. My patience was growing thin of the man's babble. "Please, just don't touch me," I pleaded, as my fingers now ran red, stuck plucked in my nose. As I gazed the area, my initial observations had proven to be true. Not a soul in sight. That being said, the city just seemed alive. Candles burning in the huts, ripe fruits clustered on the ground, and most importantly, fresh prints stamped onto the floor. I rushed towards them in a swirl of curiosity and knelt down. The moon's glow could only provide so much light, but I was certain. I had seen those prints before. 4 wide, menacing toes. I knew exactly what they were. I stood up and looked at Gregory. "We need to leave," I said. "Leave? After all we've been through?" No. "We're not done here," he replied, poking his head in and out of huts in search for anyone. "Those monsters who chased us, the ones on the bridge, and Darwin, these are their same prints. This isn't a home for humans, Greg. This is a nest infected with all of them. They'd even have to capture us. Jesus Christ. We captured ourselves," I exclaimed, distraught as the thought rang in my head. I looked up to see Gregory, who was merrily jogging ahead, ignoring every word I said. For a moment, drenched in wrath, I paused, considering an escape. A simple fuck you to all the secrets and danger that man held, and my concerns were valid. But I knew Gregory is averse to logic and reason. I also knew guilt was something I could never escape, and as a result, I chased after the fool. 50-year-old Flash was moving fast, and I knew I couldn't keep up with him. Leg damage and all, the man was a mutant, zooming forward while I hobbled from behind. As we progressed inland, the once small huts transformed into enormous lumber, tapered longhouses and birch-clad buildings, one even resembling a church, angelic and caramelized in a pale white, so Christian-like to where I was surprised Gregory didn't stop to thank God for making him an asshole. Nevertheless, we kept frolicking through the Emerald City until we arrived at the doorstep of voices. Like before, aimless chattering and beguiled by the fog of a feast. Glorious food I knew I'd never eat. My companion was still running, forcing my hand yet again. I seemed to have conditioned him over the duration of our time on the island. He was learning how to control me, whether it be by force or by example. Mincing words was my strong suit, and he was suddenly skipping over my skill. Intelligent for a man about to dive headfirst into death. Without warning, Gregory vanished, fading into the black amongst the voices rattling in my head. As I stopped and caught my breath, I spotted the source of all the squabbling. A horde of figures clustered around a tremendous bonfire. Together they sat, arched high on a structure that resembled bleachers in a coliseum. Raucous shouting shook like a hurricane of sound waves, while the crowd roared a passionate plea to the select few standing in the center of the stage. Flushed with intrigue, I crept closer, low to the floor. A cowardly skulk, but to my credit, a fear of the crowd's rage turning to me was more than fair. I scuttled under the bleacher, cloaked by its shade in the flock before me, which gleamed with the inferno's light. Its exhaust, however strong, diffused into the wretched bile in the air. Feet above stomped and smacked away, flushing down a ghastly odor that choked me. The cracks through the steps were barely visible, as the orange sheen was the only thing that met my eyes. Like a madman, I squirmed below, desperately searching for a hole to plunge my head through, a haven in which oxygen could pierce my lungs, and after some time, luck prevailed. I must have circled the entire goddamn assembly until I reached an exit point, but alas, I found it. Stacked soaring in the air was a mountain of dead lumber, firewood teetering above and towering above the masses, conveniently on the outskirts of the assembly and enshrined under a blanket of darkness. In truth, no man could have constructed a better hideaway. Anxious to peek and pry, I raced to my spot, chuffed and ready to answer the questions stuck at the forefront of my matter. For the first time in my life, I was devastated to find out just how right I was. My eyes greeted a legion of monsters. Each of the barbarians was screaming at each other, a chorus of hollering that echoed in my head, the familiar sounds of the attackers on the summit of the waterfall. Near the central bonfire knelt 4 beasts, roped at the wrists and ankles. Dolefully they lied as the fire burned near their flesh. Several winced in pain, while the monsters pleaded before the crowd. The poor prisoners in shambles, while embers danced atop their heads. As I surveyed the crowd, I noticed something rather peculiar. The cast of characters were not all like the vicious savages that chased me up and down the island. In fact, if one looked hard enough, one could spot females in the swarm. Unlike their male counterparts, they were tranquil and quiet, not patchy and demonic like their counterparts, instead having chestnut brown hair full and lengthy on their heads. The band of lanky ladies were all still unkempt, however stoic and reserved individuals, a crowd that gawked at the display of testosterone-fueled buffoonery in disgust. Many of the females were either holding or next to children, youthful innocence that was unnatural on the island. The little rascals were coated with thin, silvery locks, plump bellies, and eyes that welled with scarlet, a bulging red, but not infernal in the slightest. Their expression could best be described as wide-eyed perplexion, a sight that resembled an almost human quality, something Darwin possessed. The batch of onlookers watched as a posse of spotted beasts played with the four prisoners, slapping and tugging at their faces, cackling while doing so. These tricksters were by no means foreign, as they mirrored the same group of degenerates who attacked me at the cave. Their prisoners, though. Now these figures were a sight to behold. The captives, like Darwin, were dark, almost hairless figures, aged men with fangs that shot up through their underbites, and arms that hung low down to their legs. None of them spoke, despite the choirs of wrath each beast around them yelled. Minor words like where and how could be heard, but beyond that their voices were throaty mumbles, incomprehensible amidst the frantic fighting. Over time, the posse's once playful hitting was becoming severe, bordering on torture, as several of the captives had their eyes raked and ears chewed, rendering one creature likely blind while he sobbed on the floor. Another was frozen like a statue, preserving a slight sneer, while the smacks and jabs failed to strike a blow. There were two ends of the spectrum, while the others lied in beneath. Regardless, they'd become toys for the invalids, playthings they could twist and mangle without a care in the world. In an instant the crowd all stood and harped on the spotted men, jeering and shrieking like snakes while the torturers ripped the nails clean off their prisoners' fingers. The display had gone on long enough, as the crowd was turning on the blotched creatures. Instead, they brewed compassion and pleas for mercy, using their strength against the outnumbered and undermanned battalion. Power was shifting rapidly, and the prisoners no longer appeared apprehensive. From behind my decadent hill of lumber, I could feel the earth below me, moving. Stomps were pounding in the earth, thump after thump, as the crowd shot silent. Many of the children shrieked and hid under the mother's arms, while others curled to the ground. Their fear trickled into my brain as I flopped on my stomach, hugging the floor while my eyes peeked up at the display. Into the Colosseum, a colossus entered, a sight that shook many of the children. It was as if the Grim Reaper had appeared from thin air. Most of the observers, even the most boisterous of detractors, had suddenly grown small, cowering away in their seats while the monstrosity seethed before them. "Enough!" it roared, his thunderous voice vibrating the world around us. My eyes ballooned at the Titan standing before me. He, like the many around him, was a beast, a disgusting sight that should never see the light of day. That, however, is where their similarities ended. His build was incomparable, something the word massive fell short in defining. By a rough estimate, the creature was at least 7 feet tall and possessed tree trunk-like limbs, bull-necked and virile as he towered above the rest, his face grating against my vision, while his thick-lipped jowl could make a nightmare have a nightmare. Its complexion was a milky white, almost albino in color. All across his body lied scars and purple veins that illuminated from the hairless skin. Amongst the island of peculiar-looking creatures, he was by far the most anomalous, the face and body that left the greatest impression on me. It was as if Frankenstein's monster had come to life, plucked right out of a horror movie and planted onto my sadistic sandbox. Goliath paced back and forth in front of the captives, gazing intently at their eyes, all of which were drawn to the floor, paralyzed in fear. The exception being the smiling prisoner, who stared back up at the skyscraper chuffed to bits, finding humor in the beast's wrath. A sliver of laughter even fell from the captive's lips, which froze both the crowd and the Titan in his tracks. The giant then turned to the sniggering creature and knelt down beside him. "What's the joke?" he asked, his voice deep and drawn from the barrels of his chest. "You're the joke," the captive replied, cackling while he looked up at the tower unperturbed. The creature's jab had no effect on the monster. It deflected from his face like an arrow deflecting off a brick wall. In truth, he was more disappointed than hurt, as if he expected better from the animal. "That's where you're wrong, brother. The only joke here is your pride. Your burning pride that will wind up killing you. Now, that's the funny joke. To see that smile of yours go up in flames." The giant then circled near the bonfire, fanning his hand through its waves, mulling his next words with careful calculation as ash coated the tips of his fingers. "Where is Delta?" asked the behemoth, who traced the blackness atop each of the prisoners' foreheads. At an instant the captive's smile melted from its face. The spotted men around him simpered at the question and stepped several feet back as the giant looked onward, and then placed its hand on top the prisoner's skull and tapped his fingers while he pondered. "You have grown quiet, my brother. Has the joke ended? Has the pride burned away?" he asked. The creature was silent. The crowd was silent, and the giant was silent, each feeding off the other. "You have nothing for me," it whispered. The captive looked back up, grimaced, and shook his head no. "My people, this is what pride gives you," exclaimed the giant, his voice low but firm, traveling across the silence with ease. In a flash, the smirking captive's skull reared into the mouth of the bonfire and set ablaze. The island fell silent as his screams littered the air. The Titan then threw the man back onto the floor, where he coddled the ground, convulsing until the light vanished from his face. Burned flesh rang in my nostrils as the animal cried and wailed. The massive figure then turned to his next captive and started to interrogate him. My focus was shattered as a hand patted my shoulder. I whipped backwards in terror, only to see Gregory's eyes gleaming with joy. "There you are," he happily whispered. I shushed him and turned back towards the scene. "Not very friendly, is he?" said Gregory, as his next skull was grasped. Again my focus centered on the horror before me, and again Gregory attempted to thwart it. "Walter, do you trust me?" he whispered. "I have to trust you, Gregory," I replied. "You don't have to do anything besides answer my question. Do you trust me?" he repeated. "It's not that I don't trust you, it's just I've been very scatterbrained lately. Things haven't been adding up, and you haven't been the most—" "Do you trust me?" he bellowed, loud enough to draw a few glances from the spotted soldiers. Yes, for God's sake, I trust you. Now be quiet," I seethed. "That's all I wanted to hear," said Gregory, as he then backed up a few steps. While the man's odd behavior never ceased to intrigue me, his eyes were dialed in as the next subtle taps echoed amongst the hushed crowd. The next crown was coiled with a grasp of the mountain's claw as the tension oozed from the fibers of the floor. Before I had the chance to witness the next bout of torture, abruptly, my back heaved forward, crashing into the tower of lumber. I plummeted to the ground as the branches speared next to me, cracking into the earth and tumbling to the mossy carpet. It felt like my intestines were vacuumed up through my throat. Complete and utter fear, that's all I could sense and feel while I then shot up into the air and turned to the swarm. Dozens upon dozens of the bewildered and manic eyes locked onto mine. The entire assembly fell stunned, swirling with a multitude of emotions, ranging from euphoric grins to distraught glares from the soldiers, the noticeable exception being the skyscraper looking down at me, bursting with apathy, as if I wasn't even there. From the floor, the burned man's head rose. "Walter!" it uttered through fits of pain, his voice cracking with a peculiar bliss. "Walter!" the pack of watchers echoed. They were all transfixed as I stood there, wowed and amazed, while the children rushed to get a better look. The Colossus then walked over, the crowd taken aback by his courage. "Hi, my name is Walter. Nice to meet you. What's your name?" I asked, extending my hand to greet him, bubbly and kind, Gregory's words spilling out of my mouth. Unable to process the mania, I lost myself in the weight of fear, replicating a greater man's work in hopes of saving it in my skin. The monster stared at me, cautiously, looking up and down at my woeful and disheveled body. Bruised, painted with dirt, and likely smelling worse than he did. I was lucky to be standing in my condition, and I think he realized that. He remained silent as he analyzed me, peering into my soul with his rings of fire. His hand then gently clamped to my wrist, anchoring it like a weight chained to my arm, gripping it tighter and tighter while my heart rate rose. He then pulled me closer to his chest and smiled, peering down at me with a grin beaming with infected gums, blood-bleached teeth, and a face brimming with popped blood vessels. But before I had the chance to even blink, his claw whipped against my skull, knocking me to the floor, rendering me unconscious. No dreams were dreamt during my heavenly slumber. My eyelids unceremoniously flipped open, waking me from my joyous nightmare. A watermelon-sized welt fizzled in pain on the side of my head, a feeling that, when coupled with the sun's spotlights sniping through my eye sockets, was not very pleasant. Meanwhile, as my neck rose, my brain scrambled into delirium. It was as if I spent the past hour waxing my skull with a cheese grater. My vision blurred into a tornado of sight while my neck craned around, trying to get any sense as to where I was. Bars, steel, and a grim, dreary cage. I was a prisoner to the monster's hole, a fate I shared with others. Next to me sat the 4 captives, all lashed and bedecked in their own fluid. Blood and urine soaked their skins. Ironically, the beast with the burnt face was the least damaged of all. He was sitting upright, leaning against the cage, comforted by the coldness of steel that eased his sting. The rest of them were fast asleep, their bodies hibernating through pain. Lashings, claw marks, and bruises brushed up and down their poor canvases. It would have been cruel for me to disrupt their much-needed comas, as rest was the only vice for such a fate. Our cage was modest, mirroring a dog crate in size, suffocating the 5 of us as we clumped together like pickles in a jar. Eventually, through my drunken daze, I found a way to stand up. A simple act that elicited a vortex of aching pain that swirled in my skull. I was dehydrated and likely concussed. A single drop of rain would have done wonders, but in a cruel twist of fate, the island sculpted a cloudless sky. "Water," I pleaded, with my sand, dry, sappy tongue, aimlessly saying the word for anyone to hear. "Water," I repeated. Nothing answered. I waited as the island's flame melted any ounces of hope. Suddenly, I was woken by a splash of liquid that hit my arm, a chilled mist that eased the summer scorch from my skin. The source of my delight, a familiar face, lodging in the cage right next to mine. The face I saw soared me into shock. It was a face I should have never seen. It was a face that belonged in the afterlife. It was the face of Darwin. "Good morning," it murmured, displaying a faint grin as he struggled to stand. It was like looking at a ghost, pale and lifeless, floating in the air. Yet there he stood, like a 1,000-year-old cockroach, impossible to kill. His arm and back were oozing blood, and his once beautiful eyes were infected by blistering bruises. "Captured?" he said, as he pointed to me. Yes, last night," I replied, still startled by the sight of him. He smiled, releasing a pair of vampire fangs from the ashes of his mouth. "Captured," he said again, pointing to himself. "Darwin, I don't understand." How are you here right now? I admitted, my voice faint from exhaustion, still questioning whether my eyes were deceiving me, whether my hallucinations were bubbling to the surface. Darwin then pointed to his cage. Captured, he repeated. No. How did you survive? I was certain you were dead. Certain. Your body disappeared. You fell into the fog. I just don't understand. He made the shape of wings with his fingers and fluttered them left and right. Birds fly, he whispered. I thought he was joking. Surely he didn't think that I could believe something like that. He couldn't believe I was so daft. Darwin, help me out here. Tell me what happened. Please, just tell me the truth. No one's telling me the truth anymore. Darwin, I can't keep going along with this. With all of this. I nearly collapsed from the blood rushing to my brain. Every thought I had crippled my mind, and every truth I tried to uncover crippled my soul. I didn't know who to believe, and I no longer knew I could believe myself. Darwin then put up his hand and pushed his face close to the bars. Water? He asked. The mere word made my skull pound like a jackhammer on a steel drum. I fell to my knees and shook my head yes, unable to speak. By Darwin's leg sat a hole filled to the brim with liquid. He then splashed towards my cage as I spread my mouth wide, catching but a few gulps and swallowed them down with pride. It was a fuel I desperately needed, despite the likely vile composition it held. My mind needed to find its track, the goal I've had since the second my lips kissed the island sand. I needed to escape. Have you seen Gregory? I asked Darwin, now with a slightly clearer mind. Gregory? It repeated, revealing a puzzled look on his face. Yeah, he might be walking around somewhere. He could help us leave this place, I responded. No escape, said Darwin. He then pounded his fist against the steel, solid as a rock. So what do we do? I asked. In response, he scratched his head, consequently opening a scab that was stuck right above his eyebrow. We wait. Wait for Zeta, he grunted, and then plopped down onto the floor and closed his eyes, revealing his defeat. Is that your friend? I asked. In response, the burnt captive woke from his daze and cackled with laughter. Darwin chuckled to himself and looked up at me with his drained blue eyes. Not friends, he said. Then who is he? Why is he important? I asked, annoyed I had to keep formulating these obvious questions. Darwin turned and flexed his arm while mocking a gleaming, devious face. He was mirroring the newest monster atop my list of terrors. Ah, he's the giant, isn't he? I pieced together. Yes, and the worst little brother a person can ask for, exclaimed a broken voice. Up from his slumber emerged the burnt captive. Darwin speared a look towards the creature's way, who shrugged him off and smiled. There's no use in sheltering the man any more. If he can't freely speak beside the footsteps to our grave, then we might as well already be dead, remarked the burnt captive. Darwin's hand smothered his face while he wheezed a pit of anguish out from his mouth. I never wanted you to find this place, Walter. Never wanted Gregory to lead you here, whether he knew where he was actually going or not. I knew you would end up here if curiosity was guiding you, and so I aimed to temper your curiosity, to only speak when spoken to and to never reveal a carrot you'd want to follow. I'm sorry, Walter, but I wanted to protect you. I thought no one else could, remarked Darwin, his voice evolving to become exceptionally clear, almost human, far superior to the giant, the captive, or any other of the beasts who had spoken before. Protect me from what? To protect you from our God, to protect you from our brother, and above all else, to protect you from yourself, remarked the prisoner. We know what this island can do, what it has done to us and many before it. You do not deserve such a fate, and we feared you become what we've sought to end, he continued. I had grown flushed with questions, and yet at the same time driven by an odd feeling of rudeness, as I realized I never introduced myself to the beast before. "What's your name?" I asked it. He smiled at the question and stretched his neck out to answer. "Kappa," proud as ever. Kappa was a lanky creature, practically my height, with a milky caramel composition, hardly possessing Delta's muscular frame and bedecked in patches of black fur. On the untouched side of his head sat feathery locks of onyx, gorgeous hair defiled by his now scorched skull, which remained charred and festering, grotesque as it blinded his eye, rendering the iris white. Luckily for him, the color complemented the darkness beaming from his other eye, feeding off each other to create a maddening masterpiece. "So you're Kappa. Your brother's name is Zeta, and you're—" "Well, it seems I don't actually know who you are," I exclaimed to Darwin. "Delta," he said, and gingerly bowed his head. "Darwin is better," he grunted, and beamed at me. "Agreed. Much better," I laughed. The giant who arrived, left to boil in the summer's heat while I learned more about the island I now called home. Admittedly not as much as I would have liked, but the fact that my informants were recently tortured and mangled was a fair excuse for their inability to help. At times they could barely spark a sentence through their waves of pain. The sky above baked our skins a fresh paint of red while our cage simmered and cooked. I sat in front of Kappa, providing any form of shade I could for the man's scorched flesh, knowing he'd get the worst of it. As time drained by, the others awakened from their departures of rest, and the more I interacted with the prisoners, the more I came to realize how similar they were to Darwin. Every one of them as cordial and bright for animals. After a while, I came to realize they weren't animals at all, not even close. I was introduced to Kai, Ro, and Tao for the duration of my wait, coming to learn the family tree, a toxic forest littered with brothers, from Darwin to Zeta, all intertwined, and while reserved, all seemed to share a high level of brilliance. Each was receptive and expressive in communication, being able to read even the most minuscule of micro-expressions on my face, and quick to comfort each other when another was in pain, especially Kai and Tao, the two of which were identical. Both twins were stocky brutes that hardly seemed much younger than Darwin, attached at the hip and mirroring each other's words and mannerisms, staring at the world with jubilance through their emerald eyes. I wouldn't have been able to tell them apart if it wasn't for Tao's voice. He possessed an acute distortion, as if his voice box was replaced by a jack-in-the-box. Each and every word he let spill out of his mouth must have brought him great agony, as he mirrored the sound of a 6-year-old chain-smoker. Nevertheless, both were open and eager to learn about me. Rose seemed to be too far gone to communicate, the youngest of the group and artfully colored with a screaming red hair that puffed out from the center of his skull. One would think he'd be the chatterbox of the group, but alas, he was mute, mumbling a few words under his breath following our introduction and shaking in tremors, almost to the brink while the others around him attempted to coddle him. They were dreadfully fascinated from the world for so long. Luckily for myself, I was enclosed with a harmless bunch, with their wits and superhuman strength. If one were tragically born with a distorted brain, they could pose a treacherous threat, something that worried me, as the swarms of blotched beasts outnumbered any of Darwin's friends, a few of which could be spotted patrolling the cages. They were repulsive, like a bunch of inbred hamsters injected with steroids and human growth hormones, ambling around attempting to look busy. I looked over at my cellmates, who parked on the floor, grilling the garrison. "When do we get out of here?" I asked. "Whenever Zeta wants, he chooses," replied Tao. "Well, how long will that take?" I asked. "Delta?" inquired Kappa. "Nightfall. He waits for the sun. The sun bakes its prisoners and makes us weak," said Darwin, as he scratched at some dry skin. "He's been here before. The only one to survive a night was Zeta," said Kappa. "Born lucky," remarked Kai. Darwin then glanced at his severed arm and beaten body and laughed. Yes, very lucky." Time continued to growl at a sloth-like pace as the sun dipped in the air. Sunset was still ways away, and everyone knew it. The more we thought about time, the stronger time became, infusing its seconds with weight, and its minutes with anchors. After a while, Roe could barely breathe, his tremors almost seizure-like, while he cursed and howled. I can't no more, please, I'm begging, no more, said Rao, who trembled on the floor. What's wrong with him? Asked Hal. He's broken, remarked Darwin. Well, we have to do something, yelled Kai, who was cupping drops of water from the earth and funneling it down Roe's throat, comforting him while both he and Tao formed an umbrella of shade. You don't understand. It isn't the dehydration, the heat, or even the time. It's his mind. He's our baby brother, after all. He's been through what we have. But he's still very young. He wasn't ready for this, admitted Darwin, who appeared defeated. Out from the blue, Roe sprung into the air and screamed at the top of his lungs. Zeta! Zeta, come! Zeta, here, I'm ready! Darwin punched at his cage. You fool! You'll die! He yelled. The surrounding soldiers were laughing at the squeals and all staring at the poor creature, depleted in the dirt. As if on cue, one of the deformed mutants walked over, a smile stitched across his lips, and a spear sewn with his teeth in his hands. Wolf fangs infused into his weapon. Quiet, whispered Darwin, as everyone in the cell slithered into the back. The devil approached, his eyes bloodshot and skin crusted with heat blisters and flakes. Who spoke? It gruffed. In response, Darwin hucked a thick, juicy wad of spit onto the monster's leg, and then raised his hand. Me, he boasted. Ah, hardly surprised Delta speak. Delta need attention from all. Delta the special one. Well, because Delta is so very special, Zeta has planned for you. A wonderful plan, but before he play with you, maybe I play first, sneered the guard, while he rattled the knife along the cage bars. The guard appeared rather dim-witted, signaling a tenuous grasp of the English language. How very lonely you must be. No one to talk to, no one to love. And so you wait for a prisoner to come stumbling inside the gates, because they can't refuse you. They can't shield their eyes from your hideous face. They can't stop listening to your foolish words, and they can't leave the company of the cowardly Cater. How lucky you must be that you're the face the unlucky see, replied Darwin, unfazed by the devilish ploy. The monster's clownish smile evaporated, as an eruption of madness smeared his face. He then speared his arm through the bars, nearly shaking Darwin's chest with every strike. Darwin dodged each blow, backing up a few feet after every attempt. The attacker's arm grew deeper and deeper into the cage until his wrist was ensnared by Darwin's grasp. The spear plummeted to the floor while Darwin howled in triumph. He then started rapidly chomping away at the beast's hand, ripping away tendons and bones from the fingers out of the hapless prey. Its yelps of pain ruptured my eardrums as Darwin drew him even closer. His face was laser-focused on the guard as he chewed beefy flesh away with his razor-blade teeth. Blood gushed out from the corners of his lips until he tugged his victim even closer and spat the remains onto the monster's face. Darwin then let him go and smiled as the crowd of guards sprinted from behind, eager to extinguish the horrific display. Their fingerless victim twisted on the floor, his mug now coated with chunks of shredded skin and cherry-red fingernails. One of the blush guards started unchaining the cage, ripe with fury, while Darwin looked on unmoved, like he knew nothing would come of it. You know you can't do that, said Darwin, confident as ever. How would the mighty Zeta feel about you acting without his command? executing a prisoner before his final trial? No, that's a grievous offense, he continued. Delta is right, said one of the soldiers, who begrudgingly ripped his fellow guard away from the cell's door. Then what do we do? Another asked. Darwin then put his face close against the cage wall. Bring me your father, he howled, his voice blaring through the air like a volcano erupting. They all froze, staring at Darwin, petrified. At once all of them sprinted away. Bring the giant! Bring my brother! He and I have catching up to do, bellowed Darwin across the field in front of us, while he jumped for joy in his cell. Oh, and Keita, said Darwin, gleaming down at his scarlet-soaked buffoon, squealing on the floor. What? He answered through fits of pain. Thanks for playing,